Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It promised to be explosive, and after a barrage of social media posts from the Prime Minister's former aide, the evidence given by Dominic Cummings today didn't disappoint. Taking aim at the very top of government, claims that it was crackers. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister, that the Health Secretary should have lost his job because of lying, and that tens of thousands of people could have lost their lives because of actions taken by those in charge. Well, the Health Secretary has now responded, rejecting the claims made by Mr Cummings, who admitted he had not told the whole truth about that infamous trip to Bernard Castle. Tonight, in this special Sky News programme, we'll be hearing from a member of the committee and a scientist who advises the government to get their reaction. We'll look at the evidence behind the allegations and speak to some of the people who lost loved ones during the pandemic to get their response. And at 8:30, we'll give you another chance to see some of the highlights from today. Well, let's look at some of the claims made by Mr Cummings. On the Health Secretary, the Prime Minister's former advisor called him a liar and said he should have been fired 20 times over, including for criminal, disgraceful behaviour relating to his target for 100,000 tests a day. He dismissed government claims that a protective ring was put around care homes as complete nonsense and said that he heard the widely reported comments by the Prime Minister that he would rather let bodies pile high than have a third lockdown. A list of mistakes that meant tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. Sky's political editor Beth Rigby has tonight's main report.
Is Boris Johnson responsible for thousands of deaths?
This man knows the answers. The PM's former advisor arriving in Parliament to give his account of this government's COVID crisis, and from the outset not holding back.
The truth is that senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect of its government in a crisis like this. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
Early last year, as China began to lock down, COVID wasn't part of our daily lives, but it was coming, and the government was not alive to the threat.
The government itself, and Number 10, was not operating on a war footing in February on this in any way, shape or form. Lots of key people were literally skiing.
The PM wasn't skiing, but he was on holiday too, in Chevening in Kent. Whilst there, he missed a number of emergency COBRA meetings. In Mr Cummings' view, that may have been a good thing.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. He described it as the new swine flu.
Did you tell him it wasn't?
Certainly, but the view of various officials inside Number 10 was if we have the Prime Minister chairing COBRA meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help actually serious planning. It has this graph here.
Mr Cummings says the initial plan was to try to reach herd immunity in the population before the autumn of 2020 to avoid a huge winter spike, a plan denied by the government.
Either herd immunity by September or it's herd immunity by January after a second peak. That was the assumption.
So when Matt Hancock said on the 15th of March, we have a plan, herd immunity is not part of it, was that wrong?
That was the plan. I'm completely baffled as to why Number 10 is trying to deny that.
But it soon became clear the herd immunity plan would lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And on March the 13th, Mr Cummings and senior officials met in Number 10 and drew up Plan B.
We basically say we're going to have to sit down with the Prime Minister tomorrow and explain to him that we think that we're going to have to ditch the whole official plan and we're heading for the biggest disaster this country's seen since 1940. At this point, the second most powerful official in the country, Helen McNamara, is the Deputy Cabinet Secretary. She walked into the office while we're looking at this whiteboard. She says, I've just been talking to the official, Mark Sweeney, who was in charge of coordinating with the Department for Health. He said, quote, "I've been told for years that there is a whole plan for this. There is no plan. We're in huge trouble. I've come through here to the, Helen McNamara said, I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely I think this country's heading for a disaster. I think we're going to kill thousands of people."
Plan B meant lockdown.
On the 14th, we said to the Prime Minister, you are going to have to lock down. But there is no lockdown plan. It doesn't exist. This is like a scene from Independence Day with Jeff Goldblum saying the aliens are here and your whole plan is broken and you need a new plan, right? That is what the scene was like that morning.
A picture of total chaos in government, but Mr Cummings singling out one individual in particular.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly.
I think I heard you correctly in accusing the Health Secretary of having lied. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
That's obviously a serious charge. Can you provide the committee with the evidence behind that assertion?
Yes. In the summer, he said that everyone who needed treatment, who got the treatment that they required. He knew that that was a lie.
And in April last year, the Health Secretary announced a 100,000 a day testing target.
In my opinion, he should have been fired for that thing alone. And that itself meant that the whole of April was hugely disrupted by different parts of Whitehall fundamentally trying to operate in different ways, completely because Hancock wanted to be able to go on TV and say, look at me, my 100k target. It was criminal, disgraceful behaviour that caused serious harm. We had this terrible pledge which was hugely distorting the whole system. We also had constant repeated lying about PPE. The Cabinet Secretary said to the Prime Minister in almost the first meeting when he came back, Prime Minister, the British system is not set up to deal with the Secretary of State who repeatedly lies in meetings.
Brexit brought Mr Cummings and Boris Johnson together, and Brexit brought them to number 10. But beyond Brexit, Mr Cummings not sure they were the right men for the job.
It's completely crackers that someone like me should have been in there, just the same as it's crackers that Boris Johnson was in there, and that the choice at the last election was Jeremy Corbyn. The problem in this crisis was very much lions led by donkeys over and over again. The leadership, people like me and the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health, we let down the people on the front line.
After the misery of lockdown, the brief respite of summer, it was then Mr Cummings told the PM he'd had enough and would resign at the end of the year.
I'm not prepared to work with people like Hancock anymore. I've told you umpteen times you've got to remove him. You won't. It's going to be a disaster in the autumn, and therefore it's time that I should go. And the Prime Minister said, which I think says a lot, he laughed and he said, you're right, I am more frightened of you having the power to stop the chaos than I am of the chaos. Chaos isn't that bad. Chaos means that everyone has to look to me to see who's in charge.
But with chaos came terrible policy failures. The decision to discharge COVID-positive patients back into care homes cost the lives of so many.
Do you have any insight into how that decision was taken?
Hancock told us in the Cabinet room that people were going to be tested before they went back to care homes. What the hell happened? Now, all the government rhetoric was, we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
That's extraordinary.
Another misstep. Mr Cummings' own apparent breach of lockdown rules, moving his family from London to Durham. He now claims for security reasons.
That whole episode was definitely a major disaster for the government and for the COVID policy.
A central figure, but certainly not the one in charge.
If I could have clicked my fingers and done things, there would have been a serious border policy. Masks would have been compulsory. Hancock would have been fired. We'd have done, dozens and dozens and dozens of things. What happened is, fundamentally, the Prime Minister and I did not agree about COVID.
And there was a fundamental disagreement over the second lockdown. Mr Cummings and the scientists wanted it, Mr Johnson did not.
Surely we've got to learn the lessons from the past. And Prime Minister decided no and said, basically, just going to hit and hope.
But there was a second lockdown, and it was the beginning of the end for Mr Cummings' time in number 10. And in his view, he's not the only one who shouldn't be working behind the black door.
By the 31st of October, our relations were essentially already finished. The fact that his girlfriend also wanted rid of me was, relevant, but not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem was, fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job.
The PM's conduct in office in question.
Did you hear him say, let the bodies pile high in their thousands, or it's only killing 80-year-olds?
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
That's something the PM has explicitly denied saying. At least one of them is lying. The parliamentary committee hearing is not the major inquiry into the handling of this pandemic. That starts next year. Too late, says Mr Cummings.
I think the idea that any kind of serious inquiry and lessons learned doesn't start till next year is completely terrible. The families of all tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. There's absolutely no excuse for delaying that.
Prime Minister's Questions is normally the main event in Westminster, not today. Opposition parties worried by what they've heard.
There's a pattern of behaviour here. There was clearly a lack of planning, poor decision-making and a lack of transparency. And a Prime Minister who was absent from the key decisions.
The Prime Minister defending his record.
I am truly sorry for the suffering that the people of this country have experienced. But I maintain my point that the government acted throughout with the intention to save life and protect the NHS and in accordance with the best scientific advice. That's exactly what we did.
Over 7 hours of questioning for Mr Cummings. Now people will look to his former colleagues for answers. The time will come for the PM to tell his own story. But for now, Mr Cummings' account is the first draft of history. Beth Rigby, Sky News.
So, Dominic Cummings has said that Boris Johnson is not fit to be Prime Minister, accused the Health Secretary of lying and said tens of thousands of people could have died as a result. But do his claims stand up? Sky's health correspondent Ashish Joshi has been analysing the evidence.
Dominic Cummings' damning testimony describes a chaotic government ill-prepared to face a global pandemic. He told the committee the Prime Minister played down the threat, describing reports as scare stories. We already know the Prime Minister headed off on a working holiday mid-February, and Mr Cummings said today some other senior ministers were off skiing during this critical stage of the pandemic. We know too that Boris Johnson missed the first 5 COBRA meetings on Covid-19. On the 3rd of March, the Prime Minister was still boasting about shaking hands.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody, you'll be pleased to know.
One of the most controversial pandemic debates has been around herd immunity and if it was indeed government policy. What has become clearer today is that it was certainly a government assumption and desired, despite recent denials from number 10. On the 12th of March, the UK entered the delay phase, which the government hoped would slow the spread of COVID and push the peak of infections away from the winter. On the same day, the Prime Minister made a grim warning. Many more families, he said, are going to lose loved ones. On the 13th of March, Sir Patrick Vallance appeared on Sky News. Here's what he said about herd immunity.
I mean, what sort of percentage of people need to have contracted the virus?
Probably about 60% or so. And we think that this virus is likely to be one that comes back year on year, become like a seasonal virus, and communities will become immune to it.
3 days later, the delay policy was dropped and the country moved towards the first national lockdown on the 23rd of March. One of the biggest scandals in the pandemic has been the failure to protect the elderly in care homes. Here's what Matt Hancock told a press conference in May.
We tried to build infection control and the support and the protective ring around care homes right from the start.
Dominic Cummings said today the government rhetoric of throwing a shield around care homes was complete nonsense. And this evidence corroborates a Sky News report broadcast on the 6th of April that elderly patients were being discharged into care homes without being tested and allowing the disease to spread with devastating consequences. Today, Dominic Cummings also touched on the second lockdown. He claimed today if he had resigned in September and put pressure on the Prime Minister to lock down sooner, then tens of thousands of people would still be alive. By the 6th of October, SAGE documents show in England the number of infections and hospital admissions is exceeding reasonable worst-case scenario planning. On October 31st, Boris Johnson is forced to announce the second national lockdown. Mr. Cummings said this is when he heard the Prime Minister say he would rather see bodies pile high than impose another lockdown. This is the testimony of one man, but it does ask searching question of the government's response to this crisis. The truth may only emerge once there is a full public inquiry into the pandemic.
Ashish Joshi there, and our political editor Beth Rigby joins us now. Damning evidence, hours of it, Beth, today. But we should remember, shouldn't we, this is a man who admitted lying himself today and was at the heart of government as all these decisions were being made.
That's exactly right, Jonathan, and I'm sure that there are many. In fact, I know that there are ministers and MPs making exactly that point, that Dominic Cummings himself has been discredited over his stories around Barnard Castle and going to Durham, a story that he changed today and said part of the reason he took his family there was because of security reasons, something he didn't say in May at that very memorable Rose Garden press conference. But whether you like him or loathe him, whether you admire him or dislike him, whether you think he's credible or not, the fact of the matter is, in all of this, is that the Prime Minister made him his chief aide. He put him into the heart of Downing Street, and that put him at the table inside the room when all these decisions about COVID were happening. And in that sense, you just cannot discount his testimony. It is part of the story. It is the first draft, if you like, of history. Yes, it might have been biased. Yes, it might have been one-sided. I am sure that other ministers, the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary certainly will have different versions and different accounts, but that doesn't mean that Dominic Cummings' account shouldn't be heard. And I think for me, the main things to take away from 7 hours of testimony were two things. One was the way in which he catalogued systematic failure in government, most notably in the failure to have any pandemic planning, and then the inability to move the machine to get things to work when they needed to at speed, but also the personal attacks, if you like, that he made on the Prime Minister and about his ability to govern. It was almost like a catalogue of dysfunction in terms of government, weak leadership from the Prime Minister. And what did it end up in? Well, this was the substantive thing, I think, in the committee when he said that tens of thousands of people who died didn't need to die. And if you strip away all the drama, the psychodrama, the spectacle, the grudges, the revenge, and all of the drama around that testimony, at its heart was the accusation that we were too late to lock down the first time, care homes were not protected, there wasn't enough PPE, the border policy was a mess, and most critically, that the Prime Minister, knowing what he knew in March, also didn't want to commit to that second lockdown, and that actually affected families all around the country. And for that, that is a serious accusation, and for the Prime Minister, a very difficult one to handle.
OK, Beth, thank you for those thoughts. And just to let you know, at 8:30, we'll be replaying the main parts of today's evidence from Dominic Cummings. Stay with us for that. Well, Dominic Cummings was giving evidence to the Health and Social Care Select Committee today. That same committee will be questioning the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, next month. And I'm joined now by Carol Monaghan, who is on that committee. She was questioning Mr Cummings. She's also the SNP's education spokesperson. Great to see you after what has been a very long and busy day for you, I know. It was a long session, wasn't it? Are you satisfied that you got all the answers you wanted?
I don't think we're anywhere close to getting all the answers, but certainly it's raised a whole pile of other questions for us. And just to correct you slightly, it was actually a joint committee today of the Science and Technology and the Health and Social Care Committee. So it was a lot of MPs asking questions and a lot of, I think, issues that will require further investigation in the coming weeks, months and years.
And of course, as Beth was just saying, this is a man with an axe to grind, and so much of it was very personal. And many will have been watching it and saying, these are huge allegations, but where is the evidence?
Well, I think we're all pretty aware of where the evidence is. I mean, much of what was said today, we could have guessed that anyway. He paints a picture of a chaotic government with no contingency planning, no thoughts to national resilience. I think we were all aware of that anyway. But to have sort of some of the detail thrashed out today was pretty enlightening. He talked about the missed opportunities. He talked about the failure to learn lessons. And I think really probably the worst of all of this is the real probably arrogance or complacency with which the Prime Minister has conducted himself over the last 18 months throughout this entire episode, in fact.
Well, the Prime Minister did come in for criticism today, but he wasn't the person mainly in the sights of Dominic Cummings. That, of course, was the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, and we know he'll be facing the committee in June. He has many questions to answer, doesn't he?
I think there are a huge number of questions, and it was interesting. I mean, one of the things that Dominic Cummings said was, you know, MPs will have to scrutinise. Well, MPs have been trying to scrutinise for the last 18 months what's been going on. MPs have been asking questions, they've been writing letters, they've been raising it in Parliament, and we're just, the answers that we've been getting are not even close to being satisfactory. It's been avoidance, it's been, you know, anything, any sort of trivial sort of answer thrown back that doesn't go to the heart of any of the questions that have been asked. So if there is an inquiry, we actually need some honesty and we need some detail to be exposed, rather than this very superficial response from what we've seen over the last year from the Health Secretary and from the Prime Minister.
So do you think the inquiry should be brought forward? Do you think it should be completely independent, even led by a judge?
I think it should be independent, definitely. I think that would be that would take away a lot of partiality. So that would certainly help, I think. And I think from the point of view of the families that are affected by this and those who have lost loved ones, they deserve some answers and they deserve some honesty. I think we're starting to expose some of the honesty here, but yeah, we're going to have to dig an awful lot deeper. And unfortunately, 7 hours was a mammoth session, but it's not even close enough to get to really the heart of what went on over the last year. And ultimately, what we want to know is that lessons have been learned, because I think the big thing that came out today was in September, when the advice was being given again, and knowing what had already happened in March and April, the Prime Minister once again ignored the advice. This advice is coming from the very best people that can be offering it, and yet once again he ignored it. So I think we really, I mean, have to look at that more closely and have to be assured that actually Boris Johnson and his government are ready to deal with future crisis, whatever that may be.
Yeah, and as Beth Rigby was saying, this really is only the very first draft of history. Carol Monaghan, thank you very much indeed.
Political assassination by Parliamentary Select Committee. Dominic Cummings demolishes the Health Secretary and says Boris Johnson is unfit to lead. Will the country believe a man who only came to public prominence after his bizarre Durham trip, the fallout from which he now admits was a major disaster? And how do we respond to his damning confirmation that the care home strategy saw tens of thousands die needlessly?
The government rhetoric was, we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It's complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them, we sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Good evening. We often wonder what would happen if those in politics actually spoke their mind. Today we got a full 7 hours of what that sounds like. Dominic Cummings dropped grenade after grenade after grenade on his former boss, the Prime Minister, on Matt Hancock, whom he called a liar, on the devastating and avoidable loss of life in Britain's care homes, and on all the other strategy failings during the pandemic, which he says resulted in tens of thousands more people needlessly dying. This is one man's account, a man who was ousted uncomfortably from his job last November, a man who created enemies as well as loyal devotees, a man who may be driven by conscience or vengeance or by a need to narrate his own place in history. So what to make of it? Does it damage those in power? Does it convincingly explain what happened? Does it, crucially, make us more able to cope with a future catastrophe? We will tackle it all, beginning with our political editor, Nick Watt. And we did think, Nick, that we'd heard it all even before the morning started. What was there in it that actually surprised you?
Well, Emily, I've known Dominic Cummings off and on for the best part of 20 years, and I do have to say I'm not surprised that he's turned on a former boss who declined to accept his advice, because Dominic Cummings doesn't accept the idea of bosses or patrons. I also have to say that I'm not surprised that he's praising or just simply saying nothing about cabinet ministers who have a great future or cabinet ministers with whom he has an unbreakable bond. I'm thinking of Rishi Sunak and Michael Gove. But this was a hugely significant moment. The second most powerful man in the country at the start of the pandemic told the country today that your Prime Minister and your state failed you at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, Labour clearly think this is a very significant moment. Keir Starmer talked about it, big issue for him at Prime Minister's Questions. Boris Johnson is saying, look, my focus on all of this is on the upcoming inquiry. Ministers, they're of the view that they hope that this is not going to shift public opinion. They think that Dominic Cummings is very, very unpopular, and they also say that polling suggests that the British people have effectively reached a settled view on the pandemic, which is, yes, it was a dreadful start, but it was a pandemic, and of course the vaccination programme is now going very well. So I watched all 7 hours of that session, of that evidence. I should say, Emily, that my report does contain strong language. Always a touch of the lone wolf. Now a loner cast into the political wilderness, but still a formidable political operator with scores to settle. In the dock, charged with abject failings in Dominic Cummings' mind, stood the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary and the British state. A simple judgment about Boris Johnson.
If you took anybody at random from the kind of top 1% competent people in this country and presented them with the situation, they would have behaved differently to how the Prime Minister behaved.
Two charges were laid against the Prime Minister. Firstly, an overly lackadaisical approach at the start of the pandemic.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. He described it as the new swine flu.
And charge number two, in the autumn, a Prime Minister determined to avoid a further lockdown.
There's a great misunderstanding people have that because it nearly killed him, therefore he must have taken it seriously. But in fact, after the first lockdown, his view was he was cross with me and for others into what he regarded as basically pushing him into the first lockdown.
The greatest vitriol was reserved for Matt Hancock, who was accused of lying on multiple occasions over PPE, the NHS's ability to cope, and testing at care homes.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly.
An emphatic denial of Cummings' claim from the Health Department and short shrift from the man himself.
I've been dealing with getting the vaccination rollout going, especially to over 30s, and saving lives.
And finally, in the dock, the Whitehall machinery, guilty of misunderstanding the severity of the pandemic, guilty of assuming people would not weather a lockdown, and guilty of having no actual plan for a lockdown. But in an irony, it was one of Whitehall's most senior officials who raised the alarm.
I've come through here to the, Helen McNamara said, I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely fucked. I think this country's heading for a disaster. I think we're going to kill thousands of people.
And finally, an end to the session.
Dominic Cummings, is the Prime Minister responsible for thousands of deaths? So after a marathon 7-hour session in the House of Commons for Dominic Cummings, he's found a labyrinthine route out of the parliamentary estate and into a taxi.
A Labour MP who interrogated Dominic Cummings was alarmed by what she heard.
I think it's very clear that there are serious questions to answer about the allegations that were made today, both at Boris Johnson but also at Matt Hancock. And I really hope that Matt Hancock comes to the Commons tomorrow to answer some of those very serious concerns. But also, what we saw was a clash of egos, a tale of ministers playing politics at a time when people were losing loved ones, and that is precisely the opposite of what should have been happening.
Tory MPs now have no time for the man they once rallied to defend.
Can I make a dreadful admission? I haven't been bothered to watch any of it, and I rather suspect the rest of the country have been with me. I've got to say the Parliamentary Party don't have much time for Mr Cummings. He gave us a load of grief on his visit to the North East and his famous eye test. And actually, I don't know hardly any MPs who've even been in the same room as Dom Cummings, never mind spoken to him. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's all been a big circus, but life gets back to normal tomorrow. You know, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health are getting on with getting people vaccinated, getting the country back to normal, and that's what really matters. And I suspect that that's what matters to the people in Batley and Spen as well.
All quiet in Downing Street after a battering from the man who once ruled this roost. But a hope in these walls that such a divisive figure won't ultimately shift the dial.
Nick Watt there. Well, joining us now, the Labour MP Peter Kyle, one of the first to focus on the unfolding tragedy in our care homes, and David Gauke, former Conservative Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor. David, can I start with you? Did you believe what you heard? Did you find Dominic Cummings credible?
Well, I think we always have to be careful with one person's testimony, and no doubt others will have their say. Quite a bit of it, I also have to say, rang true. And so some of the criticisms, I think, about how the government was very slow to grasp the nature of the situation, that the Prime Minister wasn't as engaged as he should have been, and then subsequently regretted the lockdown. I think a lot of it rings true, but to be fair, you know, it's important that we hear the other side of the argument, and that this information comes out as quickly as possible.
It's weird to hear you saying that. Sorry to interrupt you, but the other side of the argument is still your own government. It's the same party, and it's the two men who were joined at the hip until last year. Do you feel able to defend the government's record based on what you heard today? Would you feel comfortable doing that?
No, not particularly. And you know, to be clear, I'm not a member of the Conservative Party anymore. What I would say is that the circumstances in March of last year were enormously difficult, and all the choices in front of the government were bad, and they were in a very difficult situation. But you know, also, to be fair, you know, people like Rory Stewart were pointing out that there was a different strategy that could have been pursued. Other countries pursued different strategies as well. So I'm certainly not here to defend the government. I think there were things that they got wrong. In terms of the sort of wider political position, as I think Nick pointed out earlier, the polling suggests that the public are making an assessment on the basis of the performance in 2021 rather than in 2020. But that's not to say that, you know, if they made mistakes, you know, we've really got to understand what they were and learn lessons.
Yeah, I should say we invited the government on tonight. They said no. Peter Kyle, well. Do you believe what you heard from Dominic Cummings?
I think the overall narrative is a credible picture. It is ego-driven, it is very dysfunctional. There are people who are unsuited, untrained, unqualified in the very, very top of government making decisions that are having a profound impact on people's lives. And I think that is the upshot of what we heard today, and I think that is evidentially correct.
How can you be qualified to deal with a brand new pandemic that is sweeping across the road? I mean, I guess the world, I should say, that is the counter-argument to all this, that it was virtually impossible.
Well, when you look at the countries that have the worst death toll per million people, you're looking at countries that have quite a populist leader at the top, Bolsonaro, Trump when he was running the country. You know, there are people who have trained, who have taken the norms of governing a country incredibly seriously. But we have a disruptive government. Dominic Cummings himself said today that he was not fit to be in that job and thought it was surprising that he was offered the job. You know, he himself advertised for mavericks and misfits, and he brought those people into government to run it in the weeks ahead of a pandemic. So there's no surprise that our government was unfit to run a country in any time, let alone a crisis.
The populist governments, do you think that Boris Johnson was swayed by what he saw from Donald Trump?
No, I think what we have to see is take them at their word at the time. So, you know, if we go right back to February, where we had a delay strategy, the reason why we had a delay strategy in February was so that we could learn from the foreign experience and what was happening elsewhere. We saw in Italy what was happening in Lombardy. At that exact time, we also saw the rampaging of COVID in Spain, where a third of people who were dying in Spain were dying in social care. A quarter of people who were dying in France in social care. If these were the lessons we should have been learning, but we delayed by an incredible 6 weeks, but we did not make any learning from that, because in that exact same period, Boris Johnson was on holiday in Chevening for 10 days. He had missed 5 Cobra meetings. Nobody was at the helm of government, and yet we had these misfits and mavericks inside Number 10 who were clearly fighting like rats in a sack, and nobody was taking responsibility for a credible public health response at the very, very top of government.
And David Gore, your former cabinet colleague Matt Hancock, dragged over the coals, called a liar, incompetent, said he should have been fired 15 times. Do you recognise that description of the Health Secretary?
I have to say that's not my experience of Matt. It strikes me that with Dominic Cummings, you're either brilliant or you're useless, and clearly he's consigned Matt Hancock to the second category. That's not my experience, and I think, to be fair, we need to be able to hear what Matt Hancock has to say. They're very serious accusations. I know Dominic Cummings was asked to provide the evidence to support those accusations, and I think Matt's entitled to have his say and to be judged on that basis rather than just on the accusations. But they're serious accusations.
What was very clear was that apology right at the beginning from Cummings for lives lost, thousands of deaths. Does the Prime Minister have to apologise for those failings we heard today? Does this push him to do the same thing right now?
Well, I think it probably does, and I think it's very difficult for the government to argue that these are matters that should only be looked at in due course after an inquiry. If the conclusion that Dominic Cummings has reached, which I think is almost certainly fair, that there was delay at the beginning of this process. I think there are mitigating factors because it was an extraordinary, unprecedented challenge. I think the weaknesses about what happened in the autumn are also issues of concern. So I think there are a lot of questions for the Prime Minister to answer out of today's testimony. A lot of them we were already aware of, but I think, if you like, the pressure on the Prime Minister increases. But as I say, the public, you seem to be giving the government the benefit of the doubt.
Well, let me ask you whether there's also pressure on the Leader of the Opposition, Peter, because it does seem extraordinary how excoriating the former advisor was to the PM. Don't you think that Keir Starmer could have gone harder for all those months, having heard what you heard today?
I think the country wants a reasonable forensic, look at the facts, and that's what Keir tried to do today. I mean, he calmly presented the facts. When you've got Dominic Cummings being hysterical, you've got the Prime Minister who's just shrugging it all off and pretending, not me, Gov. And I think what the country really wants is a leader of the opposition who is just calmly putting the facts to. Now, listen.
You've heard what David Gauke says. The public's moved on and they're just concentrating on the vaccines. That's what we heard in.
Well,
in
actually, look. Today we have had the most senior advisor in Number 10 accusing the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister of lying. We've had the Prime Minister rejecting that, so in effect calling his senior advisor as lying. They're all saying each other as lying. I'm saying quite categorically that none of them were fit to run a public service at which people's lives were at stake. We know for a fact that these things were unfolding. At the beginning of March, care homes, COVID was running rampant in care homes. They say now they didn't know. Matt Hancock, Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson say they didn't know. I stood up in the House of Commons on the 25th of March and I told Boris Johnson on the record in PMQs this was happening. Testing, that PPE, and that it was being spread by agency workers. Boris Johnson said it'd be fixed within a week. It wasn't fixed for 8 months.
Peter,
these are the facts, and it didn't happen.
You've delivered us to exactly where we're going next. Peter Carr and David Gauke, thank you both very much indeed. Well, there was too much to take in for one day, but perhaps the most chilling phrase we heard was that claim thousands died needlessly. Mr. Cummings told the panel that people with COVID were sent back into care homes, that lockdowns came too late, that borders remained too loose, that protective equipment was inadequate, there was no strategy for isolation, no early plan to shut the pubs, and that the PM had treated COVID as a scare story. Much of this is familiar, much we knew or investigated ourselves at the time. But this is the first time it's come from inside the Prime Minister's coterie. What does it feel like to listen to this litany if you lost a loved one to COVID last year? Here's Lewis Goodall.
Where did the mistakes happen? Who made them? What might have been different? These were the questions that were threaded, woven through the Cummings testimony today. A first go at shaping the history that will define these people's careers, these departments' futures, of how we come to think of what just happened, of what is happening now.
I want to clear up the confusions and misunderstandings that I can.
One might say he's an unreliable witness, his Barnard Castle escapade rendering him incredible. But it had the advantage of being the most straightforward and unvarnished account we've seen of how Whitehall and its political and policy players handled the worst crisis since 1940.
The government itself and Number 10 was not operating on a war footing in February on this in any way, shape or form. Lots of key people were literally skiing in the middle of February.
And even when officials began to take the problem more seriously, he says their ultimate political master did not.
The view of various officials inside Number 10 was, if we have the Prime Minister chairing COBRA meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help actually serious planning.
This was a theme to which Mr. Cummings would repeatedly return, to the idea that the state had to manage itself around a Prime Minister who was more of a hindrance than a help. But he does say that the Prime Minister was, in the early days at least, following advice. He thus provides us with the clearest explanation that we've yet had of the errors and the mistakes that Whitehall was making in the days and weeks leading up to lockdown 1. I.e., he said that Whitehall thought it had time, that the peak wouldn't be for months. They were catastrophically wrong. Then more failures on PPE and care homes, at which he laid much of the blame at the Health Secretary's door and that of his ruinous department.
Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It's complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
For many in the social care sector, it was like reliving the trauma of what came before.
It's the bit that's not only surprising, but really quite heart-wrenching, because we know of homes where, small homes, 20-bedded homes, who stayed infection-free and then had somebody come in from hospital and lose half the residents. So, out of 20, 10 were infected and lost their lives. And I think that's the reality of what happened because of it.
And do you think he should resign as a result of what we've heard?
Well, I think he needs to consider his position if what we've been told is a fact.
It's going to be one of the best summers we've ever had. Now, if you fellas are concerned about the beaches, you do whatever you have to make them safe. But those beaches will be open for this weekend.
But it was in the second half that the policy failures began to orbit the Prime Minister, with one refrain, a desire to be akin to his hero, the Mayor of Amity, leading, Cummings says, to one policy problem after another.
Fundamentally, there was no proper border policy because the Prime Minister never wanted a proper border policy. His basic argument, at that point, he was back to lockdown was all a terrible mistake, I should have been the Mayor of Jaws.
And so now is the time to take action because there is no alternative.
Here, Cummings suggested that unlike in spring, it was Johnson, not the system, who was fundamentally at fault.
That's why the Prime Minister was so enraged by the situation, because he knew that me and others were looking at him saying, you know, you were told, Catherine Cutt spread out all of this information to you, and that's what we're now looking at, and now you're doing it again, and now the lockdown's going to have to be worse, the destruction is going to be worse, and that means thousands of people have caught it in the intervening 5 weeks who are now going to die. And we're doing the lockdown anyway, and we're going to trash the economy more anyway.
But at the heart of Mr Cummings' evidence, a contradiction.
Sometimes it felt like he couldn't quite make up his mind. Sometimes it was all the fault of particular individuals. Yet at other times it was the fault of the dreaded blob, the malaise of the British civil service, the inherent flaws of the British state. And yet at other times those flaws could quite easily be overcome by industrious, eminent individuals, perhaps not entirely unlike Mr Cummings himself. At times then it felt like a rather underdeveloped or slightly incoherent theory of events, a tension which he never quite resolved.
And at one point, it seemed to me he had enormously overstated his case because he said, look, it's crackers. You've ended up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, someone that he was arguing was unfit to be Prime Minister. Crackers that you've ended up with me as Dominic Cummings, a senior advisor. Crackers that the whole political system ended up with Jeremy Corbyn versus Boris Johnson. Well, whatever people's politics and whatever they feel about that, he's trying to sweep away the whole of the British political system and say, don't start from here.
At times, as ever for Westminster, this felt insular. Many other European democracies had similar problems. Nonetheless, at its heart was a cascade of the most grave allegations, a system of government overwhelmed, a Potemkin cabinet, mendacity at the highest levels which endures, deaths which need not have happened. His was a partial, perhaps conflicted testimony. It nonetheless leaves much about which the remaining players must make account.
Lewis Goodall there. Well, joining us now is Mike Pagham, who is the Managing Director of St Cecilia's Care Group, and Lucy Easthope, who advises the government on disasters and has done so throughout the pandemic. Mike, can I start with you, because the human element was really the most shocking of all that we heard today. You were right in the middle of that at the time. What was it like to hear it spelled out so clearly?
Good evening, everybody. Well, I wasn't shocked by what Dominic Cummings said today, because I knew that what he'd said had really happened. We didn't have a protective ring around us. We didn't have the PPE. We didn't have testing. And I, in my home, sadly lost 4 people in those very early days. We think from someone being discharged to us without a test in those very early days. So it was heart-rending for the people, the staff and the families.
Did you believe that there was a protective shield, that phrase that was used? Did you think you were being protected? I mean, what happened when the hospital was sort of asking you to take people into the home?
Well, we'd done that routinely. Over the years, we've been taking people from hospital to be discharged before they went back home. This was in the early days when we were told, actually, it shouldn't affect care homes, so the tests weren't available. In fact, we did ask, and we did go and get our own tests for the person that became symptomatic. They subsequently were proved positive and went back into hospital and passed away there. Then the virus, we think, came to the home from that route. Of course, we try and trust the government, the people leading us, as to tell us what we should be doing, because we follow advice. But sadly, I think many of those things said today are true, and things weren't working. Sadly, social care has been not looked at properly in the last decade or more, so we weren't prepared. So all Secretaries of State really have shared a blame for that, I think.
Do you hold Matt Hancock himself responsible, or does it seem ridiculous to try and choose between one senior advisor and one Secretary of State and one Prime Minister?
It's difficult. I don't think you can rule out everything that Dominic Cummings said. Obviously, I wasn't party to any of the discussions. I don't think it'd be all at Matt Hancock's door. What I would say is credit where credit's due. I think the vaccine rollout's been fantastic. But I would just like to say both he and the Prime Minister have not addressed social care properly in the past, and they need to be accountable for delivering proper reform in the future.
Can I ask you, Professor Easthorpe, you saw all this up close, you worked with government. Was what you heard today accurate? Because Dominic Cummings painted a picture of a system in complete chaos. Was that what you saw?
There were moments today that obviously resonated, and there were certainly very many aspects that were familiar to us at a local planning level and at an advisory level. There were some fundamental things that weren't our experience. One of which was there was a classic mistake, which is, I think, used by outsiders to disaster management, which was a lot of comments were made that plans didn't exist. Plans did exist. And what we've been able to do at local level was innovate those. The other thing that was a sort of common problem that flowed from that was, this assumption that at the very highest level we were in severe trouble. And I think we felt that in emergency response and planning, but we also knew we did have plans and tested processes that we could use. And an example I would give there is he talked about they realised there was no plan for burying the dead. That was absolutely untrue. The plan was originally owned by the Home Office. It's a Home Office work stream. DHSC, Department of Health, had an initial flurry of concern that they didn't have a plan. And then we were able to point out to them that they did. It just had a different logo on it. And he did something today that I think is very common to us as planners. He assumed that because he didn't have them on his desk, local plans didn't exist, when in fact we knew they did. And I think that's really important, because I think the public should take some assurance from that, that in the same way as your bins are being emptied, there are emergency planners working behind the scenes all the time.
So should people understand that actually there were great chunks of what he said that weren't accurate?
A lot of it really resonated. It was a very difficult day for us as planners. There were things that he has suggested today as new innovative ideas that certainly somebody like myself and many colleagues have been requesting from the Cabinet Office for years. You know, we ourselves have highlighted concerns with the way the Civil Contingencies Secretariat operate. We've highlighted weaknesses. One thing he really didn't address at all today, but came up very strongly in your own report, is you don't plan for a pandemic in the 8 weeks that you get the notification of a new and novel virus. The pandemic runs through all social care and health planning all the time. And every time you diminish social care, you diminish your ability to respond to a pandemic. And I'd made that point consistently from 2016 onwards. And that's why our death toll is what it was.
Which chimes very much with what Mike has just told us. Can I ask you, Lucy, one other thing? The mantra that we all remember from those early days was follow the science, believe the experts. Was that done in government?
My own personal experience has been, as the situation evolved, they have sought a lot of advice. I've said before, it's got a lot easier for people like me to feed in qualitative advice and concerns on all sides of the picture. And it was very, very difficult in the early days to be heard. A lot of what he said there resonated with us as planners today. But what we did at local level was we've been following the science for 20, 30 years. You know, we understand the corona pandemic very well, and we knew how to trust and use local science, and particularly public health. And so for us, yes, we absolutely trusted elements of the science and understood the uncertainties within it.
Mike, I want to pick up on your last point. We've just had the Queen's speech. Social care got, I think, 9 words. Why do you think, a year on from the pandemic, it's still not considered a priority?
Well, I wish I knew that answer to that, Emily. If there were one positive thing that came out of the pandemic, it should have been social care reform happened this year. It's unforgivable, but it's been postponed yet again. And that's why I want the government to actually give us a date when they're going to deliver it. Or if they don't, step down at that time. It needs to be a priority, and the politicians need to see that.
I mean, you've heard this phrase, this allegation that he didn't care about the over 80s. Now, obviously, we have no proof. We have no categoric proof that was actually said. But do you feel that has been a problem through the pandemic, or do you think actually no, that it was always the elderly that were put first in this?
Sadly, I do think it's been over successive governments of different colours over the years that the elderly have been forgotten. I do think that should be expendable in this pandemic, forgotten. I think social care still is playing second fiddle to the NHS, and that needs to change.
And lastly, to you, Lucy, so there were so many examples given of incompetence. When you were there, when you were dealing, did you think I'm dealing with incompetent people?
I think local authorities did a fantastic job and the CCGs, but I do think central government was giving us conflicting advice. Every few days it kept changing. And even today, we're still getting different advice, always seems to come out of the bank holiday. And I do think there's incompetence at the top on this issue, certainly.
Briefly to you, Lucy, the same question.
I think, yes, I would absolutely agree with that. It was a new government, limited training. It was all the issues we've been raising before, that ministerially they were not ready for a disaster, but at local level we knew what we had to do. But certainly at central interaction, yes, definitely.
Thank you both very much. Thanks for joining us.